Hello, my name is Dr. Janice Klima, and this presentation examines Indigenous women's political authority within Revolutionary Era diplomacy. Traditional narratives of the American Revolution often focus on military conflict, colonial political leaders, and diplomatic negotiations between the United States and European powers. However, these narratives frequently overlook the complex political systems that govern the indigenous nations and shape their participation in the conflict. As historian Colin Calloway notes in The American Revolution in Indian Country, indigenous nations were deeply involved in the revolutionary struggle and navigated alliances with both British and American forces. Understanding revolutionary diplomacy therefore requires recognizing that indigenous governance systems often operated through structures very different from European governmental models. In particular, many indigenous societies organize political authority through kinship networks grounded in matrilineal lineage, where women played important roles in maintaining social order and political legitimacy. This presentation asks the following research question: how did Indigenous women's kinship authority shape political alignment and treaty legitimacy during the Revolutionary Era? I argue that while colonial treaty diplomacy relied heavily on written documentation and male diplomatic intermediaries, indigenous political legitimacy frequently operated through kinship systems rooted in maternal lineage. Within many Haudenosaunee communities, women exercised significant authority through clan systems that shaped leadership selection and community decision-making. Because colonial negotiators often misunderstood these governance systems, treaties recorded agreements in ways that obscured the political influence women exercised with indigenous societies. This project draws upon a combination of primary and secondary sources in order to examine the intersection of diplomacy, governance, and kinship authority. Primary sources include treaty documents, congressional records, and diplomatic correspondence produced during the Revolutionary Era. These materials reveal how colonial negotiators documented diplomatic agreements and understood indigenous political representation. Secondary scholarship provides interpretive frameworks for understanding indigenous governance systems, kinship structures, and the broader political context of Revolutionary Era diplomacy. As historian Daniel Reichter has emphasized, interpreting colonial encounters requires historians to examine indigenous perspectives rather than relying exclusively on European documentary records. Methodologically, this project treats treaties not only as legal documents, but also as historical artifacts that reflect the assumptions and limitations of colonial diplomatic systems. While treaty texts provide valuable evidence of negotiations, they often fail to record the internal political processes through which indigenous communities evaluated agreements. By examining treaties alongside scholarship on indigenous governance traditions, it becomes possible to analyze how kinship authority functioned within diplomatic decision-making. Historians of the American Revolution have long examined diplomacy between indigenous nations and colonial governments. Earlier scholarship often emphasized military alliances, territorial negotiations, and the actions of prominent male leaders who served as diplomatic representatives. For example, Richard White's influence, the work on the Middle Ground, examines the negotiated relationships that developed between indigenous nations and European powers in the Great Lakes region. Within this framework, treaties were frequently interpreted as the primary mechanism through which political authority and consent were established. Written agreements, signatures, and official documentation were treated as clear indicators of political legitimacy. Similarly, Colin Calloway's work on indigenous participation in the American Revolution demonstrates how Native communities navigated shifting alliances between imperial powers during the late 18th century. More recent scholarship in Indigenous history and women's history has challenged these assumptions by emphasizing governance systems that operated outside colonial political categories. Scholars examining indigenous societies have highlighted the importance of kinship structures, clan relationships, and matrilineal descent in organizing political authority. Historians such as Barbara Mann and Sally Roche Wagner have also emphasized the influence of women within Haudenosaunee governance traditions, particularly through clan systems that shape leadership selection and community decision making. This scholarship suggests that understanding Indigenous diplomacy requires looking beyond formal treaty documents and examining the internal governance structures that shaped how communities responded to diplomatic negotiations. Within many Haudenosaunee communities, political authority was closely connected with matrilineal kinship structures. Clan identity and social relationships were transmitted through the mother's line, creating networks of obligation and responsibility that structured political life. Historians such as Barbara Mann and Sally Roche Wagner emphasize that women with clan systems exercised important political responsibilities, including roles in leadership selection, mediation, and maintaining the balance necessary for effective governance. Although male representatives often appeared during diplomatic negotiations with colonial officials, their authority remained embedded within broader kinship networks that included the influence of women within the community. Diplomatic agreements were also communicated through ceremonial practices and symbolic objects such as wampum belts, which served as visual records of alliances and agreements and reinforced relationships between communities. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784 provides an important example of the tensions between colonial documentation and Indigenous political legitimacy. Following the American Revolution, the United States sought to establish peace and secure territorial boundaries through treaty negotiations with Indigenous nations. As historian Colin Calloway explains in The American Revolution in Indian Country, American officials often viewed treaties as instruments for consolidating territorial control after the war. At Fort Stanwix, American negotiators treated the treaty as legally binding based on the written signatures of Indigenous representatives. The treaty required several Indigenous nations to cede significant territories to the United States, reflecting American assumptions that formal written agreements could establish permanent territorial sovereignty. However, the treaty process itself often failed to capture the internal political processes through which Indigenous communities evaluated diplomatic agreements. Colonial negotiators frequently interpreted the participation of individual male representatives as representing the consent of entire communities. From the perspective of Indigenous government systems, grounded in kinship authority, however, political legitimacy often depended on community deliberation that extended beyond the individuals who appeared in treaty negotiations. The Treaty of Fort Harmar in 1789 attempted to reaffirm earlier agreements and stabilize relations along the frontier. Federal negotiators again relied on recognizable male representatives to serve as diplomatic intermediaries during the negotiations. The treaty sought to reaffirm territorial boundaries and establish peaceful relations between the United States and several indigenous nations. As historian Gregory Dowd notes in his work on Indigenous resistance during the early Republic, these negotiations often reflected American attempts to impose territorial boundaries that did not align with Indigenous political traditions. This reliance on documentary authority created a mismatch between federal diplomatic practices and Indigenous governance systems grounded in kinship relationships and communal decision-making processes. Within these systems, women often played important roles in shaping political consensus within clan networks, even though their authority was rarely acknowledged within the written treaty process itself. The Treaty of Canandaigua, signed in 1794, represents one of the most significant diplomatic agreements between the United States and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during the early Republic. The treaty established what is described as perpetual peace and friendship and recognized territorial boundaries for the Haudenosaunee nations. Historians such as Francis Jennings and Colin Calloway emphasize the importance of this treaty, as an attempt to stabilize diplomatic relations after years of conflict along the frontier. Although the treaty documents reflect an effort to create a stable diplomatic relationship, the agreement also illustrates the broader tension between written documentation and kinship based authority. From the perspective of the United States government, the treaty represented a formal legal agreement recorded in written form. However, with Indigenous communities, the legitimacy of such agreements often depended on internal governance processes, shaped by clan systems and community consensus. Within these governance systems, women's authority within maternal and kinship networks continued to influence political decision-making, even when colonial negotiators focused primarily on male diplomatic representatives. These treaty negotiations illustrate the broader influence of documentary authority within colonial and early American governance systems. European and American political institutions place great emphasis on written documentation as the ultimate source of political legitimacy. Treaties, signatures, and official records were treated as definitive evidence that diplomatic agreements had been formally established. As Richard White argues in The Middle Ground, colonial diplomacy often relied on written agreements to formalize relationships that, within indigenous political cultures, were typically maintained through ongoing negotiation and reciprocal obligations. Scholars examining the politics of documentation have also highlighted how written records could reshape the recognition of identity and authority. Lingell, for example, argues that colonial and modern bureaucratic systems frequently privileged documentary evidence over kinship-based systems of belonging. Political scientists and historians such as Audra Simpson have similarly examined how political documentation systems influence recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and political authority. Recognizing this difference helps historians better understand the complexity of Revolutionary era diplomacy and the challenges Indigenous communities face navigating colonial political institutions. From the biblical perspective, agreements between communities carry ethical responsibilities that extend beyond legal documentation. Biblical traditions emphasize justice, honesty, and covenant fidelity in relationships between peoples. Proverbs 11:1, for example, emphasizes the importance of honest dealings and faithful agreements. Applying this perspective to Revolutionary era treaties highlights the importance of honoring diplomatic agreements and recognizing the authority structures that give those agreements legitimacy. Understanding Indigenous governance traditions can therefore contribute to a more ethically grounded interpretation of historical diplomacy. In conclusion, examining Revolutionary era diplomacy through the lens of Indigenous governance reveals the importance of kinship authority and the influence of women within political decision-making processes. Colonial treaty systems relied heavily on written documentation and male diplomatic intermediaries, but these records often fail to capture the internal governance structures that shape Indigenous political legitimacy. By examining treaties alongside Indigenous kinship traditions, historians can develop a more complete understanding of sovereignty, diplomacy, and political authority during the Revolutionary era. Thank you.